Hi, well, we're back again. Right now, we're talking about learning. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as our definition of learning that we're going to be working with throughout this lecture and this content. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. One of the most important words that we have in this definition is relatively. And it's only relatively because it's something that can actually shift. It's something that you can lose. If you can imagine, maybe some of you actually played an instrument when you were younger. Now, if you were presented with that instrument today, and let's say having not had a lesson or any practice in the last 20 years, or maybe the last 10 years, you might actually struggle quite a bit in order to be able to perform. That's what we mean by relatively permanent change. Now, this change occurs through our experience, and that's the focus of the learning theories that we're going to review, are the various kinds of experiences people can be exposed to. One of the things that I want to make note of in regards to learning is that this is one of the areas of psychological research where we really see the significance of animals being used in order to understand not only theoretically but actual literal learning processes within species. One of our theorists that we'll talk about today really believed that the learning process is the same independent of your level of cognition. So that means any species will follow the same paradigm in learning. Right now we're going to start off with classical conditioning. And classical conditioning was originally begun by Ian Pavlov. He was a physiological psychologist who was actually studying salivation in dogs and digestion when he stumbled upon this theory. Because he lived in an occupied country where he wasn't really allowed to publish or expand his knowledge, he didn't really become forefront on the scene of learning and classical conditioning until after we learned about John Watson. And John Watson was the individual that did the experiments with little Albert. I'll be sure to post a video in our fun stuff folder regarding little Albert and the processes that John Watson actually used. To summarize the classical conditioning theory, we have this diagram in front of us. We see that we have what we call the unconditioned stimulus, or in this instance the UCS, which is located right over here. We have the unconditioned stimulus, which is located on this upper portion, which is food, and food would naturally cause a dog to salivate. So this is our unconditioned response. This is something that is inherent in the individual. What we did is we would test to see if the stimulus that we were going to add to the relationship was actually neutral. So we would ring the bell for a little while to ensure that the dog did not actually salivate in response to that. So this response didn't already exist. And then what we did is we added that neutral stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus, or to the food, and it would result in this salivation or the unconditioned response. Eventually, depending upon the strength of the situation or the frequency of the situation, the bell would cause, and I use that term very, very loosely, but that bell would inspire the conditioned response. Salivation stays the same throughout the different stages of learning, but here we see that that salivation is in response to something that would not normally make a dog salivate. I actually like to write out kind of a mathematical equation on how to process this. We have our unconditioned stimulus and we have our unconditioned response. You'll see it as UCS, UCR, or US, or UR. On the exams written from the lecture-based questions, if we end up having those, you'll see UCS or US used interchangeably. Just be prepared for that. So this is the naturally occurring relationship. And what we add to that is the neutral stimulus that you'll see here in blue. That neutral stimulus added to the naturally occurring relationship over an extended period of time or of various intensity. What was neutral actually becomes what we call conditioned. So you'll see how I kept the colors the same between the neutral and the conditioned, just to drive home the point that those two stimuli are the exact same. Okay, but what has happened is that that conditioned stimulus has taken the part of the unconditioned stimulus in this relationship. And the unconditioned response doesn't change when it becomes the conditioned response, except for which stimulus encourages it to happen. So the important thing to remember is that what was once neutral becomes conditioned, and that the response stays the same. It is the stimulus that changes, that identifies a learning as having had occurred. Now, here are some primary facts about classical conditioning that I want to make sure that you have. First of all, we have generalization. This is when that conditioned response, that salivation, occurs to every bell. What has happened is that the dog has generalized the sound, the tonal experience of a bell, to everything, to all bells, not to specifically one bell. If we encourage that conditioned response to occur only to one specific bell, that's called discrimination. That's the ability of the entity to ferret out the stimuli and only have a response to a very specific stimuli. And then, of course, we have extinction. And extinction occurs when the conditioned response is weakened by presenting that conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus. So if we present the bell over an extended period of time, the dog's salivation response would eventually become extinct, which means that he would stop salivating in response. But if we were to add that food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, if we were to add that food back into the relationship of the bell, then that dog would begin to salivate again. We also have this phenomenon called spontaneous recovery, and that's where all of a sudden we see that conditioned response. It reoccurs after a time delay without any additional learning. So let's say 3 years down the road, we've no longer paired the food with the bell, and then all of a sudden the dog hears the bell and starts to salivate. That would be spontaneous recovery. Now, I have posted what I find to be a very fun video in our fun stuff folder. The video itself is titled The Office, and this is what I think is a really fun example of classical conditioning in what we would normally see as primetime television. All right, until next time.